Daz Bellows gave his son a stern wag of the finger.
Into the bed with you, boy,
he said gruffly. Little Tip gave a hefty yawn and a stretch, then climbed into his straw nest, his tail curling around him. Outside the tree, the wind was howling, and the snow was forming mounds. But inside, it was warm and dry, and Daz tucked Tip in with a thick blanket.
That's my lad,
he said softly, and fluffed the scruffy fur between Tip's mouse ears.
Dream of spring, and pretty things that bloom.
He turned to blow out the enormous candle that stood in the corner of the bedroom, but Tip sat up.
Don't leave yet, Papa,
he said.
The wind is fearsome tonight. Stay with me and tell me a story.
A story, eh? And which one do you have in mind?
Tip's tail twitched with excitement.
Tell me the story of brave Prince Colin, in the kingdom of men.
Daz chuckled, and settled into the walnut shell rocker that sat near the nest. Candlelight danced over the face of his excited son.
Very well, Mouseling,
he sighed.
Lay back down, and I shall tell it. Our story begins with a young human, whose age was not dissimilar to your own. But the story does not begin in winter, oh no. It begins in a rich and beautiful summer.
And so, Daz began the story, reciting it, word for word, with all the proper flourish, just as it had been told to him, by his own pap, many nights, long ago. Once upon a time, there was a kingdom of men, and it was ruled by good King Andawn. King Andawn was a kind and generous man, and loved by all his people. But he was lonely as well, for he had to raise his son, Prince Colin, all alone. Prince Colin had grown into a fine young man, and the king was very proud of him, yet the king missed his queen, who had passed away many years ago. King Andawn spent much of his time with his advisors, and together they decided on how to best rule the kingdom and protect its people. They would order the construction of important buildings, ensure that food was plentiful, and forge alliances with neighboring lands, such as wealthy, next door. But one summer day, a visitor from a faraway land arrived at the castle. She was heralded by dark skies and a chill wind. She was Venestra, beautiful queen of an unheard-of land called Darkland. She had traveled with a contingent of several hundred soldiers, dressed in jet-black mail, and she was escorted by King Andawn's longtime friend, a pointy-faced man with a curiously curled moustache, named Captain Verst. Verst claimed to have met the queen during his travels, and insisted she come to meet the king. Venestra's visit seemed to lift King Andawn's melancholy, and for this, everyone in the castle was grateful. A mere fortnight after her arrival, King Andawn proclaimed his love for Venestra. Colin, and the king's advisors, found this troubling. The following week, the king announced his intentions to marry Venestra. Colin, and the king's advisors, found this even more troubling. The marriage announcement brought dark days with it, and King Andawn fell ill. His malady was mild at first, little more than a raspy cough and fatigue, but soon he paled, and could not leave his bed. Tilda, the castle's healer, used all of the arts at her disposal, but no remedy that she knew of could relieve the king. She could only shake her head, and say,
"There is something strange afoot."
As the king's illness grew, he began to struggle with even ruling from his bedchamber, and so, he began to pass authority to Venestra. The Dark Queen put Captain Verst in charge of the houseguard, and he replaced most of the garrison with Venestra's own cruel soldiers, men who bullied and bothered the household staff. Soon, most of the staff had fled the castle, save those, such as kindly Miss Maggie, the cook. At night, strange noises echoed down the empty castle hallways, and Miss Maggie could only shake her head and say,
"There is something strange afoot."
During the day, Venestra could be seen gliding through the castle, scolding her soldiers, who seemed able to do little more than brawl and break things. The queen spent much time visiting the castle's forge, from which came the sounds of hammering and hissing steam. Maginot, the castle's mystic, would stroke his beard and say,
There is something strange afoot.
Soon, Prince Colin could take no more, and so, he summoned the king's closest advisors, to a secret council, in Maginosi's laboratory. Burly Nes Bellows, the tinkerer, was there, newly evicted from the forge, where he had toiled for many years. Tilda, the healer, was there, as was old Maginos himself, he, who had served Colin's family, for generations. Together, the four hatched a plan, to drive Venestra, and her men from the castle, and back, to whatever terrible land, they had come from. But they were too late. The doors to the laboratory were kicked open, and there stood Captain Wurst, and a great many of his guard. The four were arrested for conspiring against the king, and Captain Wurst smiled cruelly, when they were thrown into the castle dungeons, alongside the worst scamps the kingdom had to offer. When they had been left alone, only Maginos seemed undeterred. He linked his fingers in a strange way, puffed up his chest, and blew into his hands. He let loose a high whistle, and a few minutes later, the whistle was answered by the appearance of his pet Meeps, the tiny ruby-red dragon. Meeps flew in unseen, high above the heads of the guards, and he flitted through the bars, and landed on Maginosi's hands. In his little jaws was a single strand of jet-black hair. Maginos patted Meeps on the head, and held the hair aloft, for all to see.
This is a strand of Venestra's hair,
he told them.
She is clearly a magical being, of great power. This hair contains enough energy to allow us to transform, thus enabling our escape. But what mundane creatures should we change into? Whatever it is, we will have no means of turning ourselves back.
Colin and his companions fell silent, unhappy at the prospect of not being humans.
Mice,
said a voice from the shadows. It was Filch, the notorious thief. He had spent most his life robbing the good people of the kingdom, until King Andorn's sheriffs had finally caught him. He now shared their cell.
We could escape into the sewers from here,
he said, pointing to a small grate on the flagstone floor in the nearby room.
No one asked you, scamp,
growled Nez. Suddenly, there was a noise from the guard room.
There is no time for argument,
shouted Maginos. He waved his free hand over Venestra's hair, muttering ancient words that time has since forgotten. Glowing motes of blue light fell from the hair, as if they were water, and they began to swirl along the floor as if blown by unseen gusts. Soon, the jail cell was filled with a brilliant maelstrom of supernatural power, and then, without warning, it burst and vanished. And where there had been 5 prisoners in the cell, there were now but 5 tiny mice.
Well, bother,
squeaked Nez.